February the 6th, in the year 1685, Whitehall Palace, once the epicenter of Restoration splendor, reeks of desperation. The candlelit corridors echo with the rustle of silk slippers and the muttered prayers of courtiers too afraid to look grief in the eye. In the royal bedchamber, beneath gold-stitched tapestries and heavy crimson drapes, the King of England is dying, and it is not a pretty thing. Charles II, that long-limbed, lustful lion of the Restoration, gasps like a drowning man. His once handsome face is pallid and bloated. His limbs are useless. His bowels have given up entirely. His breath smells of rot and brandy. He is 54, and the sins of his flesh have come to collect. The royal physicians' quacks dressed in velvet flutter about him like crows at a feast. They bleed him, burn him, bathe him in vinegar. They push powders of crushed pearls and unicorn horn. One recommends pigeon dung, another brings a bezoar stone. It is less a hospital than a farcical alchemy experiment gone terribly wrong. Charles, delirious, mutters nonsense, names, laughter, pleasantries. Then, one final plea emerges from his cracked lips, not a prayer, not an apology to his people, nor a reflection on empire or eternity. Let not poor Nelly starve. Thus ends the reign of the merry monarch, with a sentimental whisper about his favorite mistress, Nell Gwynn, the actress with a mouth as sharp as her curves. To understand how such a man ended up adored, mocked, and mourned in equal measure, we must return not to his deathbed, but to his birth. Charles Stuart was born on the 29th of May, in the year 1630, the second son of King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria of France. His arrival was celebrated with fireworks and fanfare. But by the time Charles reached adolescence, his world was unraveling. England was in chaos. The English Civil War pitted Parliament against the Crown. In 1649, Charles watched his father march to the scaffold. The executioner's axe didn't just claim a king, it carved trauma into the prince's soul. That day, Charles learned two things: that thrones are fragile and that life is short. From then on, he would live for pleasure, and plenty of it. Exiled across Europe, Charles bounced between the courts of France, the Netherlands, and Spain. It was in the decadent palace of Louis XIV that he learned a new lesson. If you can't keep power through fear, keep it through charm. Kingship didn't have to be austerite, could be adorned with satin sheets and wine-drenched laughter. When the English tired of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell, they summoned back the Stuart prince. In the year 1660, at age 30, Charles made his triumphant return to London, a city still grey from Puritan gloom. Overnight, it was drenched in music, mascara, and mischief. He married Catherine of Braganza, a devout Portuguese Catholic, for diplomatic reasons. But from the start, the real action was elsewhere, specifically in his bedchambers. Barbara Villiers, the ferocious beauty with a venomous tongue and a married surname, was already warming his sheets. Charles installed her in court as a lady-in-waiting to his new queen, which is a bit like hiring your ex-girlfriend to chaperone your honeymoon. Barbara bore him 5 children. She wore diamonds to mass. She scandalized even the French, but she was merely the first of many. From then on, the royal court became less like a government and more like a very expensive, highly theatrical brothel. Actresses, noble women, laundresses, courtiers' wives, it hardly mattered. Charles II was an equal opportunity libertine. By the mid-1670s, he kept no fewer than 5 official mistresses at the same time, each in her own luxurious townhouse, each with her own allowance, staff, and children. At least 14 of his illegitimate children were formally acknowledged, granted titles, estates, and privileges. The Duke of Monmouth, his son by Lucy Walter, would later try to seize the throne. Other bastard sons were given duchies and military commands. Charles had no legitimate heirs, but he was certainly not infertile. And these weren't just flings, they were politics. By the way, while Charles handed out duchies like hors d'oeuvre, all I'm asking is a click. Hit subscribe, cheaper than a mistress, and less likely to start a war. Now, about Nell Gwyn. Unlike the other court beauties, Nell was born in a London brothel and rose to fame on the stage. She was clever, cheeky, and completely uninterested in court etiquette. She once told an angry mob that she wasn't the French Catholic whore, she was the Protestant one. The crowd roared. She was a woman who could make a king laugh, and that made her invaluable. She bore Charles 2 sons, received a house in Pall Mall, and remained his favorite for over a decade. Even in his final moments, she was on his mind. Other favorites came and went. There was Louise de Querouaille, the sultry French spy, who allegedly reported pillow talk straight to Versailles. Charles gifted her titles and vast estates, while she slipped intelligence to Louis XIV. There was Hortense Mancini, niece of Cardinal Mazarin, bisexual, bold, and rumored to duel in men's clothing. She scandalized London by fleeing her abusive husband and taking refuge in Charles's palace. Then there was Catherine Sedley, daughter of a poet, and known as the mistress who looked like a cook's maid but talked like a scholar. Her dry wit and complete indifference to beauty standards made her one of Charles's most amusing companions. Charles's love life was not a string of accidental romances, it was a political infrastructure. Foreign policy, court appointments, even parliamentary negotiations were affected by who had his ear and his body. Mistresses received pensions, drawn from public funds. Some sold influence. Others were placed in diplomatic schemes. The crown became a boudoir, and diplomacy a whispered pillow affair. Within the palace, the king hosted intimate masques, secret gatherings where courtiers dressed as mythological figures indulged in wine and pleasures, while musicians played madrigals and poets composed lewd verses on the spot. Restoration culture reflected this decadence. Playwrights like John Dryden, William Wycherley, and Aphra Behn churned out bawdy comedies that parodied morality and championed libertine heroes. It was Charles's ethos in theatrical form, but behind the laughter loomed darker consequences. The treasury strained under the weight of pensions, jewels, and estates granted to royal mistresses and their children. Parliament grew restless, not just about the king's personal life, but about the influence France wielded through Charles's bed. The court, once known for splendor, became a punchline in London's underground press. Satirical pamphlets called his mistresses the king's breeding mares. Even the Anglican clergy recoiled. As supreme governor of the Church of England, Charles's behavior was a theological embarrassment. Some bishops refused to preach in his presence. Others avoided court altogether. And then there were the whispersones that turned into roars as Charles aged. By the early 1680s, the king's health began to falter. He became bloated and sluggish. Rumors spread that he suffered from venereal disease, especially syphilis. He walked slowly, his face flushed unpredictably, his once bright eyes dimmed. In February of 1685, he collapsed. Over the next 4 days, his condition worsened. His bowels failed, his speech slurred, his body, swollen with fluid and fever, stank of decay. Alchemists were called in. Priests hovered, unsure if he would die Protestant or Catholic. Charles, in his final days, reconciled quietly with the Catholic faith. He converted on his deathbed an act that scandalized the kingdom and confirmed many long-held suspicions. But even then, his thoughts returned to pleasure. Not repentance, not the kingdom, not legacy. Let not poor Nellie starve. These were his last words. On the 6th of February, 1685, Charles II died, leaving behind no legitimate heir and a royal court so tangled in debauchery it would take decades to untangle. Yet for all his scandals, Charles was not hated. In fact, he was adored. He had charm, he had humor, he forgave his enemies, he walked among his people. He brought back theater, music, and color to a gray, puritangent, weary nation. He restored not just monarchy but merriment. But merriment, as Charles knew, came at a cost. Behind the velvet drapes and theatre masks, England teetered on religious strife, financial strain, and dynastic doubt. The question haunted court and commons alike. What came after Charles? He had no legitimate children. His many bastards, however charming, were barred from the crown. And his heir, his brother James, was a Catholic in a Protestant realm, where even whispers of popery stirred panic. Charles avoided rebellion not through force, but through artful indifference. He practiced a calculated tolerance, suspending anti-Catholic laws when convenient, restoring them when pressured. His declaration of indulgence in 1670 promising freedom of conscience provoked fury in Parliament. But for Charles, it was politics, not principle. He sought loyalty, not dogma. Yet danger came anyway. The popish plot of 1678, a web of lies spun by Titus Oates-claimed Catholics, aimed to kill the king and crown James. The nation descended into hysteria. Innocents hanged. Mobs rioted. The exclusion crisis followed, and in 1681, Charles dissolved Parliament rather than let it bar his brother from succession. It was his boldest and riskiest move. His court reeked of rosewater and debauchery, but his rule was sharp beneath the perfume. Charles used spies, arrests, and backroom deals to hold power. He played the fool, but ruled like a strategist. He also reshaped kingship itself. Unlike his father, he made no thunderous claims of divine right. He preferred charm. He wandered London in disguise, joked with commoners, and drank with actors. He was accessible, theatrical, and dangerous in his subtlety. Yet for all the pleasure, his reign ended with a question mark. The Restoration dazzled, but left a shaky foundation. His charm could not be passed down. His court glittered, but the monarchy trembled. Still, his reign left deep scars. The extravagant spending, the French influence, the bastard aristocracy, it all haunted the kingdom long after the laughter faded. And his descendants, legitimate or otherwise, still pepper the bloodlines of Britain's noble families. He proved that absolute power need not be cruel to be dangerous. Sometimes, all it needs is a wink, a mistress, and an open bar. Charles II's death marked not just the end of a life, but the close of an era one that historians would come to call the Restoration, though some might argue the revelry would be more accurate. In the weeks following his passing, London sank into a peculiar kind of mourning. Black drapes lined the streets. Church bells tolled in low, somber rhythm. But behind closed doors, gossip resumed its natural flow. People whispered less about the king's final confession and more about the pension rumors who among his mistresses would be paid and who would be cast aside like yesterday's lover. Parliament convened with a sigh of relief. The merry monarch was gone, and in his place came his brother, James III, stricter, more devout Catholic whose sense of fun could not have filled a chamber pot, let alone a throne room. The transition was jarring. Gone were the masquerades, the mistresses, the whispered trysts behind velvet curtains. In their place came sermons, suspicion, and political crisis. The contrast was so stark, it made even Charles's critics long for the good old sinful days. But the cultural residue of Charles's reign could not be erased overnight. His influence had soaked into every layer of English society. The Restoration had reawakened English theatre, long shuttered by Puritan rule. Women were allowed on stage for the first time, shocking traditionalists and delighting audiences. Restoration comedies, dripping with innuendo and cynical wit, flourished. Characters like foppish rakes, cross-dressing heroines, and cuckolded husbands mirrored the farcical dramas playing out in the king's own bedroom. Beyond the arts, Charles's legacy lived in the architecture. He commissioned grand, lavish, and modern. He transformed Hampton Court and redesigned parts of London after the Great Fire of 1666. He appointed Sir Christopher Wren, whose designs would lead to the creation of St. Paul's Cathedral, a symbol not of penance, but of glorious rebirth. And what of science? Surprisingly, amidst all the orgies and wine, Charles also founded the Royal Society in 1660, which became one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world. He patronized thinkers like Isaac Newton, Robert Hooke, and Edmund Halley. In the same palace where courtiers once disguised themselves as Roman guards to participate in bedroom ballets, the laws of motion were being discovered. Charles may have ruled with his libido, but his court also ushered in the early Enlightenment. Yet for all these contributions, the contradictions of Charles's reign remain deeply troubling. He was charming, yet manipulative. He was tolerant, yet self-serving. He presided over a cultural flourishing, even as he used public funds to bankroll his private desires. He protected religious minorities when it suited him, but allowed secret French payments to undermine national independence. He laughed easily, but governed lazily. His life was a masterclass in charismatic neglect. Today, more than 3 centuries later, his portrait still hangs in galleries. His face-long, sly, amused invites curiosity. Historians argue over his political skill, his religious leanings, even the exact number of his children. But one thing remains certain: scandal, silk, satire. Hit subscribe, Charles would have.